This is GM Daniel Naroditsky. Welcome to the final round of the 2022 FIDE World Blitz Championship. Magnus Carlsen takes on the Uzbek phenom, Grandmaster Nodirbek Abdusattorov, who defeated Magnus in the 2021 Rapids. So the world champion has a personal vendetta against the Uzbek Grandmaster. And we have a traditional Ruy Lopez, Magnus pushing the pawn up to d3, as is very fashionable now for the last couple of years. And this is still very traditional waters. An early a4 by Magnus. Of course, he threatens to capture on b5 and forces black to make an early commitment on the queen side. Black can push the pawn up to b4, which is exactly what Nodirbek does. But the drawback of that move is that the c4 square is now available as a transit point for usually white's knight. And the knight does indeed come out to d2, and it can continue on to c4, or, as is more traditional in the Ruy Lopez, it can move back to f1 and then to g3. Carlsen moves his pawn up to c3, grabbing more of the center and preparing a potential expansion with d3, d4. I'm sure that this position has still occurred many, many times in Grandmaster practice, but Nodirbek is taking his sweet time deciding where to put his light-scored bishop or whether to move it at all, and he doesn't move it yet. He instead buttresses the pawn on b4 with rook to b8, and there's that classic rook e1 move. Of course, the e-file is closed, but it is important for white to vacate the f1 square for a knight maneuver to g3. Knight a5 by Nodirbek, tickling the bishop, which moves back to a2, and now a queenside expansion of his own with c7, c5. But Magnus, he says, I'm ready to fight, and he pushes the pawn up to d4, forcing more commitments from black. We have a trade on c3, and Nodirbek has nicely positioned his rook on b8 to benefit from that. He controls the open file, but now he faces a good amount of pressure on the e5 pawn. I really like the way that Magnus has handled the opening. He's built up a time advantage, and he's built up a significant amount of pressure on black's center. Nodirbek, he can take on d4, but then he's going to be left with a very nasty backward pawn on d6. That's not really what you want on the Ruy Lopez, and instead he chooses to keep the tension. Knight a5, back to c6 it goes, and he turns the tables on white. He says, two can play at that game. I'm pressuring your d4 pawn, which Magnus pushes up to d5. A big decision by the world champion to close up the center and send black's knight into exile on b4. b4 might look like a nice square, but that knight doesn't really have a way back, so it's kind of a double-edged sword there as Nodirbek moves his other knight over to h5. But has he allowed a knight capture on e5? No, because he would have had a knight fork on c2 at the end of a line. Great calculation by the Uzbek Grandmaster, but Magnus, look at what he does there. He pushes his pawn up to a5, and he severs the only link that the knight on b4 would have had with his other pieces. Black could have played a5 and supported that knight. Instead, the knight on b4 is now basically on its own. But Nodirbek says, no, it's not on its own. I've got my brother helping me. He moves his knight down f4, and now the b4 knight can jump into d3. And I think Carlsen is going to have to protect that d3 square if he wants to keep the b4 knight locked up. The battle revolving around the question of whether the knight on b4 is a weakness, or is it black's greatest asset. Carlsen twirling a pawn as he often does, taking his time. He's built up a sizable lead on the clock. He can afford to take even a minute if he wants to. He's still over 2 minutes on the clock. He can play knight d2 back to f1. He can move his rook up to e3. He's got a million ways. He can even play rook to a3. He's got a lot of ways to defend the d3 square. And this is a potentially crucial decision. What he really wants is a move that combines the defense of the d3 square with a buildup of pressure on the b4 knight. But I don't see a way to do both of these things at the same time. Carlsen continues to ponder his moves. He is now down 20 seconds on the clock. He seems a little bit frustrated here as he continues to ponder this important decision. And finally, he decides on knight d2 to f1. And the benefit of this move is that the knight on f4 can now be eliminated if white so chooses by the dark-squared bishop. And now it's Nodirbek's turn to take a think, but he doesn't take a long one. He develops his bishop to g4, building up the pressure on white's king side. I like the way Nodirbek has handled the last couple of moves. He's turned the tables on the clock. He's potentially turned the tables in terms of who has the initiative, but Carlsen just has a knack for getting out of these situations and turning the tables for the last time. He's now down 30 seconds on the clock. It's time for the world champion to pick up the pace. Nodirbek threatens to take the knight on f3 and then deliver a knight fork on c2. A fork that was possible many moves earlier if white had captured on e5, and now knight e3 is Magnus's choice. A nice move defending the c2 square. Nodirbek keeping the tension, dropping his bishop back to h5, and there's that rook a3 move we talked about earlier. Magnus preparing to encircle the knight on b4 by moving the rook to b3 and then maybe getting the dark squared bishop involved via d2 or a3. But Nodirbek, queen to c7. Magnus ignores bishop d2. The bishop on c4 is nicely protected by the knight on e3. Look at how nicely Magnus has arranged his minor pieces. All of the critical squares are covered. c2 is covered. d3 is covered. f3 is covered. Nodirbek, he's got very impressive looking pieces, but I don't see a way for him to make inroads into white's position, and the clock is ticking literally and figuratively. The clock is also ticking for the b4 knight, and a big decision by the Uzbek Grandmaster. He decides to take on f3, and I think he wants to follow up with knight b4 to c2, deflecting the e3 knight from its defense of the c4 bishop, and thereby solving the problem once and for all of his b4 knight. And there he goes. Knight takes c2, queen takes c4. Things looking pretty good here for Nodirbek as he finally eliminates his b4 knight and trades it off for the c4 bishop. Now we've got a material balance, but here goes Magnus's knight. It's threatening to move to f5. Suddenly it's black's queen. That's now in a fair bit of trouble as the rook on d1 menacingly x-rays it. And white threatens knight f5. Nodirbek has to defend that square or move his queen back so that knight f5 doesn't come with a fork. He moves it back to c5. I thought he could have played g6 in order to protect that f5 square once and for all, but instead he has allowed the knight to jump into f5, and now he's starting to think that was a questionable decision. I think Magnus might be taking over the initiative. The bishop moves up to g5. It protects the knight on f4, which Magnus could capture, but first he knocks the bishop off of g5. An excellent move by the world champion as he burns the flames of the initiative. h4, saying, get off me, get off g5. And if the bishop leaves g5, it leaves the knight on f4 more vulnerable than ever. And the only reason the black is not losing a pawn here immediately is because the queen on c5 is keeping in contact with the a3 rook, which is protected by the queen on f3, but things looking very precarious for Nodirbek. They're looking precarious for Magnus's clock, though. He's under 30 seconds, and he moves his rook up to c3. Ooh, and now the d6 pawn is potentially going to fall, and if that pawn falls, it is really the linchpin of black's entire structure. White will have a monster pass pawn on d5. I don't see a way for Nodirbek to keep in contact with that pawn, and he doesn't. He takes on a5. That's a pretty meaningless pawn. And before taking on d6, look at how patiently the world champion handles these positions. First, he plays the move g3, knocking the knight off of f4. And Nodirbek, he has to continue circling back. Instead, he decides to sack on d5, a desperation measure. He takes d5. He wants to push e4 and open up a discovered attack on white's rook, but I don't buy it. And neither does Magnus. A calm retreating move with the rook, a discovered attack of his own on the queen on a5, and I think Magnus is just winning a full piece. I think Nodirbek blundered that move. He's down to 14 seconds. Things looking good here for the world champion. Nodirbek has no choice but to move his queen away. And Magnus, he's toying with him, playing with his food. Rook to c1, another in-between move, forcing the queen further back into exile. And once the queen moves back to a7 or b6, now Magnus captures the knight on d5. He is up a full piece, and he is about to send the flames onto the king side. Look at that knight on f5. He can go queen g4. He can take on d6. But first, he takes care of business by protecting the bishop on d2. Nodirbek down to his last seconds. Rook after d8 and king g2. Such a typical Magnus move. He just calmly improves his position. And now he sends the rook down to c6. This game is over. Red Rover. He takes on d6 with a fork. Everything's collapsing. Here goes another pawn. And Nodirbek, he's a full piece down. And he extends his hands. And that means Magnus Carlsen, with a fist bump and a hand wave, he wins the 2022 FIDE World Blitz Championship in style. What a final game for the world champion. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these Blitz videos. Thank you for watching.